Levy is Children's Levy Allocation Committee is coming to order. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to wish everybody a happy new year as we begin our first Portland Children's Levy Allocation Committee meeting of 2010. I'm City Commissioner Dan Saltzman, and I'm also the allocation chair. Joining me today are my fellow allocation members. On my far right is Alyssa Kinney-Geyer, the city-appointed representative. Next to me is Adrienne Livingston, the county-appointed representative. On my far left is Ron Beltz, representing the Portland Business Alliance. And right next to me is Multnomah County Chair Ted Wheeler, representing the Multnomah County Board of Commissioners. Moving on to the Children's Levy staff, Program Director Lisa Pellegrino, who oversees the after-school and mentoring programs as well. Assistant Director Meg McElroy, in charge of early childhood programs. Lisa Hansel, who takes care of foster care and child abuse prevention and intervention programs. Communications Director Mary Gay Broderick, and our fiscal specialist John Kelly. As we always do, I begin with a background on the Portland Children's Levy. The levy was first created by city voters in 2002 and overwhelmingly renewed in 2008. Last year, the allocation committee, last year being 2009, the allocation committee invested more than $36 million in 70 proven programs helping 16,000 Portland children and their families in the areas of early childhood, after school and mentoring programs, child abuse prevention and intervention, and foster care, helping children in foster care succeed, which is a new investment area approved by the voters last year. The levy operates with a 5% administrative cap, so that 95 cents of every dollar goes directly to proven programs that are achieving positive results for children. As we move into the next phase of the levy, we will continue with our successful leverage fund. In fact, that's what we'll be talking about today. The leverage fund matches public funds with private dollars to make even more resources available for Portland's kids. So today, as I said, the leverage fund is our only topic, and we'll be discussing the guidelines and discussing and voting on the guidelines that will shape how we award $3 million in leverage fund partnerships. So we'll begin first with a motion to approve our minutes from our last meeting of December 15th.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Marianne? Second.
Okay. All in favor? Say aye. Aye. Okay, the minutes are approved. And as we always begin every meeting, we have a public comment portion, and this is for anybody that wants to speak to us about anything related to the levy. Do we have anybody who wishes to address us generally? Okay, I see 2 hands raised. Okay. Why don't you come on up? Grab the microphones, and if you could just give us your name and who wants to start? Okay, you're going to start. Give us your name.
Good afternoon, Portland Children's Levy Allocation Committee members. I'm Charlene McGee, a native of Liberia, West Africa, and I'm speaking as Vice President of the African Women's Coalition. I'm here on behalf of the Board of Directors to offer our apology for the mishap last month. I'm also here to share the board's unwavering commitment and to briefly share our organization's history, mission, accomplishments, and finally provide recommendations to the committee. African Women Coalition was birthed in 2003 by a group of mostly African women who realized that no other organization was addressing their needs. They wanted to create a gender and culturally specific organization that empowers African women and their families. AWC acknowledges the need for ERCO's Africa House and advocates for their service. We ask for a both and versus an either or approach. As African immigrant and refugee women, we are deeply rooted in the community and understand firsthand the challenges encountered by our constituents. As development studies have shown, investing in women reaps great returns for communities and families. In many places torn by war and in many refugee families, women are necessarily the breadwinners. I'd like to list some of our past successes. They include a doula, a midwife training, partnering with the International Children for Traditional Childbearing, providing practical life skills such as driver's education, helping moms to navigate public transportation to ensure the success of children while allowing the moms to gain independence and serve as examples to their youth. We know this is important because public transportation is how 70% of our members attend our meetings and events. AWC's Youth Leadership and Engagement Program, which historically have included an African Heritage Camp and after-school homework club. A concrete example of our success includes a photographic depiction, which you have in folders for you, and it's here, of the African girls basketball camp at Hofstra Middle School, which we wish to share. In 2009, we also mobilized a large gathering of African women and their families at the Center for Intercultural Organizing in response to the brutal death of a Congolese woman at the hands of her husband. Recently, we secured a grant to observe National Women's and Girls in HIV and AIDS Awareness Day, and among other things, are working with partners like Washington State Center to hold a half-day Women and Girls Health and Action and Empowerment Symposium in March 2010. All this is happening despite the challenges that we face as an organization in transition. Since we emerged as an independent nonprofit in September of last year after being under the leadership of Lutheran, we have been understaffed. We are in the process of hiring volunteer staff to assist the board in the daily operations of AWC, and Anna will share more about that. The leadership and communication style of AWC represents the diversity of the diaspora we originate from. We strive diligently to embrace the different styles within the membership and the board. As a committee, we hope that you will maximize the power that you have to ensure viable grassroots organizations like African Women Coalition with a proven track record of success will be supported to deliver programs and activities. In closing, as a grassroots, culturally and gender-specific nonprofit, we recommend a lower leverage fund minimum in the range of $100,000 to $175,000. This is how the Children's Levy can help and be most impactful. Additionally, we ask that provisional policy is adopted to allow grassroots organizations with a competitive and proven track record, even those that are experiencing a period of transition, to receive provisional funding. The future of AWC is exciting, and we ask you for support in continuing to empower and to meet the needs of African women and their children. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlene.
Yes, my name is Ann Schneider, and I'm a member of the board also. And I just want to say that I have an extensive background, having worked with the community college, Mount Hood Community College, for the last 20 years, working with employment and training, and particularly focusing on ESL and limited English speakers. So I'm on the board. I'm volunteering extensively to help get programs on the ground. I wanted to share two of the programs that are currently we have funding for, and we're also forming small volunteer teams made up of members who are currently of African heritage, and also generally volunteers from the community. We're doing a literacy training, a literacy one-on-one tutoring program, and I know there's lots of ESL in the community, but there are many women who are not served by those services. These are women who may be more homebound, maybe they have some reason that they can't participate in the program, they don't have the confidence, their language level is low, they're working, and they don't have time to access ESL when they're coming home and have family responsibilities. So we're setting up a one-on-one tutoring program in which we're doing both the west side, west side to Hillsborough, and also east side to Gresham, where we're matching volunteers with tutors, and we're also working with our membership to be sort of sisters with the women who are part of that. So part of the program, the integration of the ESL, is also finding out what that woman's goals are, whether it's to be able to access the bus, to be able to interact more successfully with her children's teachers, whatever that is. So it's a very flexible, customized kind of program, and we're starting that. We're doing that right now. And then the youth program, which has, as Charlene was referring to, has already a track record of 3 years in which there were mentors and tutors that were set up. And we are currently doing that also with a small grant and with volunteers. We are going to focus, build on the Hosford program that we had been part of, and we're stretching out to 2 other schools. So there are connections, though, because in the youth program, that youth coordinator and those volunteers are working with families, and that means they're working with the women who are concerned about the well-being of their children. So there's a lot of connection as to when they're working with the families and the the parents. They're also we are also looking at the education of those women. So those are just two of the programs we're currently doing, and we're going to be continuing to ask for more resources from you. But we're doing it, and it's sustainable currently by volunteers.
Okay. Thank you.
Talk a little bit more about
Oh, and I just wanted to mention that you'll see in your packet, we were partners with the Hosford program, in which the young women were part of the African team, and we as African Women's Coalition, we created the uniforms so that those young women would be culturally sensitive, they would be able to participate, and we wholeheartedly support those young women, and many of them were in our youth program, and also participated in our culture camp.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Anna Sidigu, and I'm originally from Kenya, and I also serve on the board of the African Women's Coalition. And I want to reiterate our apology and also to reassure you of the board's commitment to the sustainability of the AWC. And I also want to talk about next steps. So during this transition period that Charlene briefly mentioned, the board has been working to ensure the AWC's longevity. And we are all volunteers with limited financial resources, so all board members are participating in fundraising efforts. So among those, we've each committed to hosting a house party, and we've already successfully hosted 2 house parties. 2 board members recently secured grants on behalf of the AWC, and more are in the works. And we've also hired a temporary grant writer to help us with these endeavors. And in December of 2009, we hosted a great event at EcoTrust Building, which was funded in part by EcoTrust. And we had about 125 of our constituents who showed up, and there was just so much excitement. I wish you could have been there. But it was time for people to come and celebrate the AWC's work. And these included people who had not been part of the AWC for years, but who were excited by the change in leadership. And so we want to carry that momentum forward into 2010. So in terms of next steps, we're working with another grant writer as well, who's a volunteer. And we're also in the process of hiring volunteer staff, as Charlene and Ann mentioned, including 2 volunteer co-executive directors. And we're also advertising a youth program coordinator position, which is funded in part by a grant we recently received. And in addition, we're collaborating with groups like the Center for Intercultural Organizing and IRCO's Africa House to do outreach to Africans in the Portland area for the 2010 census. And our grants team is reconnecting with establishing relationships with national and regional funders, and we continue to meet with area funders as well to build relationships and forge partnerships. So in closing, I just want to reiterate that the AWC is uniquely positioned to have a critical impact on the lives of African women and children, in large part because of our gender-specific analysis and because of our grassroots base building. And as you've heard and seen today, we've already had a great impact on the lives of African women and children, and we're really committed to continuing that work. And so what we're asking for is your support, and we hope that we've collectively addressed all your concerns. We're happy to, answer questions. You can always call us, ask questions, and we look forward to working with you in the future. And so on behalf of the AWC, we want to thank you so much for giving us this time to talk.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. So moving on to our only topic today, actually our main topic, is the Leverage Fund and the guidelines for it. And we're going to begin by having staff come up and provide us an overview of the recommendations and how the new Leverage Fund would operate. And that's going to be, well, I guess all 3 of you up here. So
Phalanx.
Start with Lisa Pellegrino.
Yes, I was going to try to. So last time you had an extensive presentation from Meg and from Lisa Hansel about the proposed guidelines, and then there was some feedback from you all to the extent we had time for it, and some thoughts, and we kind of took those things as well as some public comment. We took those things and tried to tweak some of these recommendations, and in some cases, despite feedback, recommended against tweaking. So I thought I would go through what we recommended be changed and also address some of the things that you all talked about but we did not recommend be changed and give you kind of the reasons. For the audience, just so everybody saw, there are a list of the revised guidelines over there, so you should be able to follow along with what the changes were. Okay, so first off, in the challenge grant section, in discussing the available funding and the funding limitations. And under there is the minimum grants last time when we had the leverage fund, the minimum grant was $250,000 over at least 2 years. Staff recommended that that stay the same, despite I know there is some discussion of lowering that amount. The main reason that we did not recommend lowering it was around administrative burden. The lower that the grant minimum is, the more applications that you receive to review, and then the more grants typically you're going to make with a lower minimum. So that's kind of our concern. We're at 70 right now, and I think we're just concerned about capacity to be able to get through the review process and monitor additional grants. If you do choose, go ahead.
As far as it's a minimum of 250 over 2 years, is there a maximum year capacity? What's that range?
Up to 4 years.
Up to 4 years.
Okay.
Okay.
To within the timeline of the current levy. So 250 over 4 years looks a lot different than 250 over 2.
That makes
Exactly.
sense. Okay.
And if you do choose to go lower, I guess as a staff, we're recommending holding the line at 200 for that reason. That would be essentially 50 a year if you went for 4 years, if you went out over the life of the levy, which our minimum grant on an annual basis in the competitive round is 30 a year. So it's not extremely different. I mean, they have to get matching, so it's a different situation. Although I'd say typically most programs that we fund, that we only give $30,000 a year to, are getting other funds from other people to fund the same program. So in essence, it's not that different than the competitive side, I would say. So that's the first guideline over which there was discussion and which staff did not recommend a change, but we felt we should address. If you go down to number 4, where we have eligible forms of match, okay, so these are the kinds of things that people can use as matching funds. We made some changes there, so staff is recommending that we have at least half of the money be cash match. And we are recommending that there be allowed to have an in-kind match of up to 50%. Of the match, and that we value volunteer services, or I should say the value of those services can be used for 25% of that in-kind match. And the reason we put that limitation on it was feedback, some from you, some from others, around the possible advantage of organizations that use volunteers as their model. So there are some mentoring, as you're well aware, some mentoring organizations that only use volunteers as mentors, that they would have an advantage in being able to come up with in-kind match because their model is built around using volunteers, whereas other organizations may use volunteers but have mostly paid staff delivering services. So some folks thought that would be sort of an unfair advantage of those types of organizations that use large numbers of volunteers to deliver their programs, to deliver the basic services of their program. So that was our recommendation to deal with that. And then the last recommendation, last change, was to give preference for applicants with a greater than a 50% cash match. And that was based on some feedback from you all, of some hesitations on some people's parts, not everybody's parts, about allowing in-kind as match at all. So if folks are still feeling that way, that would be a way to deal with that, is to give preference to those who have more cash as match. Okay. All right, if you go to the next item, which is number 5, the eligible in-kind match. So this goes into much more detail about how you would have to, or the sort of the rules about using in-kind as match. And just as a preface, these are based mostly on the federal regulations, because federal grants allow in-kind in varying amounts to be used in their grants. And these are pretty much taken from there. We didn't use every single one, but many of them. So I'll go through them briefly. There's a lot of things written here, so I don't want to go through each, things in lots of detail. But if you have questions, I'm happy to answer questions. So in-kind resources, the concept is that the resources that you would be using as in-kind have to be necessary and allowable, so necessary to deliver the program, and allowable under our normal regulations, that we can verify them, that they're going to be used in the proper period. The contributions can be a variety of items, so it could be physical items that you might use. Somebody donated you a copier or a computer, for instance, or equipment or space, so donated facilities would be allowed to be valued. And then, of course, volunteer services. There's more detail there. I won't go into reading all of that detail since I think you've seen it before around valuing volunteer services. And as far as how we would go about valuing them, it's pretty much a fair market standard, fair market value standard. So physical items, actual cost or value, space and equipment, the actual rental cost or the fair rental cost for the space. Volunteers, it would be for the job. Were you to pay for that job, what would you have to pay for it? So if someone is volunteering as a volunteer mentor, you might liken that to your frontline staff, which would be, whatever you're paying people to do that similar type of work. So that's kind of the concept there of how we would determine that value, and we would ask the grantee or the proposer to give some support for that value, how they made that valuation. And then folks also wanted to know what sort of documentation would we require on an ongoing basis to be assured that the in-kind was being delivered as anticipated. So we imagined that we would, again, federal standards I think are fairly thorough. They would have to be verifiable and documented within the organization's records. They would have to be there would have to be something to support the valuation, right? So evidence about what you pay other employees, et cetera, and then you have to keep track to the extent you're getting any kind of stuff in. You have to have records that demonstrate that you've received it, when the date was, et cetera. You have to have a timekeeping system for volunteers, which is something that most organizations do if they have volunteers. So that's pretty much sums it up. So those are kind of the more detailed version of how we would deal with in-kind. And I think it's fairly thorough. I don't know that we would need to go more thorough than this. This is going to be the other thing to keep in mind around challenge grants is that part of our staff's fear about this is quite a bit of work for us that is different than what we do in our other grants. We don't have to monitor and evaluate this type of information, so this is going to be a more extensive process for us to make sure that folks are adhering to all those standards. So that's partly some of our nervousness about having too many applications and to investigate and too many grants to monitor in that department.
Can I point out one other thing?
Sure.
At the time that we did our competitive grant making and we're trying to prepare for you all the information that you needed to make those funding decisions, we were monitoring other grants, but they were coming to an end. And so to think about going through this type of examination of grant application to prepare you all for decision making on top of our now 70 grants to monitor is a pretty big administrative jump, and we don't necessarily have additional capacity. So I want to sort of provide you with that caution as you're listening to us with these recommendations, especially around thinking about that lowering that minimum grant amount, knowing that there's a lot more sort of due diligence on the in-kind front that we would have to be doing in these grants, as well as verification of cash match. So sort of in the back of your minds, I hope you'll continue to consider that.
It's a more rigorous, what we're proposing to do with this leverage fund is a much more rigorous process than what we did in the past. So it's going to be more of a jump for us. Okay, so moving on to eligible cash match sources. So again, this recommendation has not been changed, and there is a division about the type of cash match sources that different applicants could use. So the first type of applicant is a nonprofit organization, and we sort of spell out what can be used there, and there wasn't a lot of contention about that. We also spelled out what local governments, if they wanted to apply for these leverage funds, could use as matching funds. And we heard from a number of folks last time about allowing governments to use their general fund resources as match. And what you can see that we have written there, or our recommendation, is not to allow that, not to allow general fund resources to be used as match, but instead to use specific funding streams that, particularly coming down from the federal government, and particularly we're interested in new funding that might be available locally from the federal government, that we would be willing to match those types of grants applications by local governments, as well as to the extent that local governments are securing, particularly foundation grants or corporate or business contributions. Some local governments do get that type of funding, particularly for schools or school districts. There's different kinds of grants that come through in that department, so we would be willing to match those as well. Because they're verifiable and we can understand when they happened and what they're doing pretty easily. We recommended against allowing general fund resources to be used for a few different reasons. First, we're concerned that it will skew competition in favor of government. Government has vastly more resources at its disposal than most nonprofits. And to be able to tap into those resources much more easily than someone who's got to go out and fundraise on the street, which is what the nonprofits have to do for the most part, could really make it much easier for government to get these funds than it would be for nonprofits to get these funds. Another concern concern that's related to that is that the size, because of the amount of money at government's fingertips, relatively speaking, to what's at the fingertips of most nonprofits, we only have $2.5 million in this fund. We have some concern that it would get eaten up by significant applications from local governments who are able to shift general funds. The other concern, go ahead.
$3 million, don't we?
Well, we have 2.5 in the challenge grants. Right now, it's proposed to go 2.5 in the challenge grants, 500,000 in the collaboration grants, which is a different process, which I'll get to in a second. So another reason or another concern of staffs is around trying to verify, since the concept is to be trying to going after new money that we're bringing to our funding areas, we have some concern that it's going to be very difficult to trace within all the possible local governments that could apply for these funds, which are many, state, county, educational service districts, city, school districts, schools, Commission on Children and Families, community colleges, public colleges. That's 9 different entities. We are no experts in other, except for the city perhaps, and I'm not sure I call myself expert, but at least I have some knowledge of the city's funding and budgeting process. I can't claim to know much about others, and we're concerned about trying to follow those processes enough to understand how was money moved, where was money moved, does it qualify for whatever kind of stricture we're going to put around that. And then last, I think we have some concern around unintended consequences. Encouraging governments to chase money from us by moving their funds around could have the effect of merely changing programs within funding areas. So in other words, they might be funding Program A in child abuse prevention and intervention, and they decide they want to get funding for Program B. They're able to cut funds, shift funds from one program to another and seek matching resources from us. And all that has really happened is that money has been shifted. We haven't gained anything in terms of trying to serve more. That local entity is not able to serve more people as a result of raising additional funds because they haven't raised them, they just moved them. So there's some concern that we might encourage that behavior and not really be furthering our own objectives particularly. We'll be furthering the objectives of the applicant more so than we'd be furthering our own objectives in that. And it's not going to be easy for us to tell whether that's occurring, frankly. So those are our concerns, or the bulk of our concerns about other governments being able to use general funds. So we have kept our recommendation that you can use it, local governments could use it to get federal resources, but not, they could use federal resources rather as the other side, the matching funds to a grant from us, but not their general funds. Okay, I think that is sort of last piece of explanation. The rest of the guidelines were not changed. The one caveat I'll say around number 8, which is the timing of the funding cycles, depending on how things work out today and if there is additional work to be done on clarifying any of these guidelines for your purposes, that initial deadline of March 1st might need to be moved back a little bit. So we need to kind of see where we stand at the end of today and go from there. So we might have to go back a couple of weeks potentially before we could begin running things, or a month. We'll see how many changes you all want to make, I guess. And then the collaboration sort of grants were a different set of parameters around those. I guess I won't necessarily go into describing that again. I maybe just wait for questions and see if people have questions that want to discuss that.
If you just give
do you want me to do
capsule,
a brief?
No, not just a capsule overview of that, since I myself forgot about it. So
okay.
Everybody else.
Well, so the challenge grants, the conception is that the people who would apply
Collaboration grants, you just challenged.
Right, but I'm distinguishing.
Oh, sorry.
So the challenge grants, that's okay. Challenge grants, the concept was these would be applied for by providers of services of some sort. And it would be a formal application process similar to the RFI process, that kind of thing. The collaboration grants process, we're imagining something different. It's not something so much where people come and apply. The idea would be to set up a collaboration committee with at least one, hopefully 2 of you on it, and then working to recruit some other members to look for collaborative opportunities in the community to work with other funders. So it's more of a funder-to-funder relationship, which is something that we sought to create in the last leverage fund, but we didn't really have a lot of success with because I don't think we had the right structure around it. So that's really the idea, is to try to generate proposals with using the committee resources, and also to hopefully piggyback off of people who are working on this. So I know Alyssa is part of an early childhood learning community that involves a lot of funders and who are looking at ways to how can we collaboratively fund things that are on all of our agendas. So how can we work with them potentially, because that's a group that's been meeting and discussing doing that, and are there other groups like that we don't know about? So that's kind of the idea, is it's not so much of an application process from service providers. It's more of a generated at a different level. And staff would sort of assist in creating those proposals and bringing them to the committee, the full committee, for consideration. So that's a smaller pot of funds, $500,000 is what we're recommending putting into that. And again, keeping watch over it. If things aren't going anywhere, we're not really finding any collaborations and nothing is happening, then I would recommend we put it into the challenge grants. I mean, it would be as simple as that. If we don't get any traction and we're not able to really move forward with the idea, I mean, I think we'll concede defeat and put the money out there. So that was the idea. So does that answer your question, Stan, for giving a basic picture?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
I do have a question back to it's kind of multifaceted, so hopefully I can get it out clearly. Back to the revenues for the leverage funding cannot exceed 30% of the applicant's revenues for the last closed fiscal year. Is that, and I'm thinking in mind of those smaller grassroots nonprofit organizations, does that mean that, so if we have $250,000, that it's that total amount, or is it over the period of time? So if it's $250,000, say over 4 years, that I'll say over $50,000 a year. Is it of that budgeted year that it's 30% of that budgeted year? So therefore, okay, I just want to make it
annual,
clear.
Yes.
Right.
It's based on the annual request.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's an annual organizational revenues to your annual grant total.
Over the life period of that match.
Yeah, I mean, usually we're looking at the first year. Usually the amount that people are requesting is similar in all years. It's not, maybe it goes up by cost of living, but it's not like radically different. I mean, we might have to look at something different if people requested a pittance in the first year and very much more in that might call for.
I just wanted to make sure it wasn't like up front where you were taking 30% of that last closed fiscal year of the total matching funds. Instead, that it was looked at kind of equally divided in years.
Yes,
yeah.
Okay.
It's annual to annual.
I
And also volunteer labor can be part of your revenue. Okay. I mean, that is part of the revenue. I mean, we've allowed that in the past.
Okay.
So.
Others? Yes, Chair Wheeler.
I just want to say I appreciate you're putting a lot of thought into the question of local government matches. I think you've made a persuasive case, so that's not an issue I would pursue. I would have one question with regard to the federal funding piece, though, particularly for school districts. I think there is a case to be made that school districts are relatively transparent in their budgeting process. It's relatively easy to see, if you will, where the shells are. Districts have come forward and have put dollars on the table recently, particularly for the after-school programs category generally in our community. Are there any streams of funding that you can think of that are not specifically listed on our list of potential match sources for school districts that we should include? Are we including Title I? Are we including, if a school district came forward with a general fund match, they would currently be excluded? And I'm just wondering if there's any way to open at least the door for the conversation if school districts were to come forward perhaps to protect an after-school program or one of the Sun sites.
But not having federal funds, coming forward with their general funds.
Right, and so I want to take the county off the table, but I'm just thinking and I wish we had I don't know if we have any superintendents here today, but I would be curious to know if there isn't an opportunity for school districts to potentially match resources. In that case, I don't see them naturally competing with the nonprofit sector or CBOs, but potentially helping solve some of the problems that all of us in this room are facing. I'm really asking as a question. I don't have a clear answer.
I mean, I'm hesitant to make an exemption because I think some of the same things apply in the sense that, I mean, lots of nonprofits deliver after-school programs too. Now, if the district is currently running it, it's less, in other words, if they're looking for money for additional funds
or providing
to be
the facility,
matched.
If they're, it could be the in-kind contribution, in which case they are eligible, if I understand correctly, right? So providing facilities, for example, for an after-school program, they are eligible, but if they also kicked in some funding to make it happen, I'm just a little reluctant to close the door completely in the event that happened, just knowing, and this is somewhat personality-based as opposed to institutionalized, But we have been very blessed in this area to have superintendents who are willing to scrap a little bit and try and make these programs work. I just want to make sure we're not inadvertently closing a door that maybe we should leave open just a crack. I guess that's my only red flag. But other than that, I think your analysis is very good. And I think you've raised some questions that frankly make me look at it through a different lens. So I just wanted to say I appreciate the thought you put into it.
Thanks.
Are there questions?
Yeah, well, I'll just comment on that too. I thought it was a compelling case, but I also thought that you presented a very compelling case at the end of our last session, which we didn't really have a chance to discuss. And I guess I would just want to go on record for saying that what I would value most is the flexibility to make those decisions when the proposals come forward, because we don't know what funding streams are going to open up. And to me, the top criteria that we should be putting, number one is what are the emerging needs? Number two is who are delivering the best services in those areas? And number three is where can we get matching funds? So for instance, the Park Rose School District that you talked about that has a real issue of teenage pregnancy, if that school district were able to get some EST funds and match it with CHIF and possibly some PTA money, the church across the street, foundation, you're hobbling things together and we're automatically tying off our hands somewhat arbitrarily, in my opinion, by saying we're going to close the door on that. I had to laugh a little bit when you talked about the abundance of funds that local entities, public entities can tap into, and I'm just thinking about the loss of county funds compared to, the relative loss compared to what some nonprofits were able to maintain in this environment. Some certainly took a hit. So, that's one example. The other is that the Portland Education new plan is that serves from early childhood up through senior education is going to have some new funding available. And to not be able to tap into that, I think, again, we're just tying our hands.
Let me ask you, what would be the consequence? Because you made the capacity argument, too, which I think is a very common sense argument to make. And we only have so much staff capacity here, and it could get very complicated very quickly. What if we left, what do you think would be the consequences if we left this door open for the school districts? What if school districts, not county government, not the state, not the ESD, well, I guess from Melissa's perspective, perhaps leaving the ESD on the table, but what if for the educational institutions we left the door open? Would we have the ability to do this, or is it still too big of a project given our capacity?
But I think a lot of to me, the objections are not different in either situation, because I think trying to figure out where money is coming from into the district, given that most districts have constricted budgets and no local governments really are in an increase mode. We also don't know what's happening on 66, 67 yet, which might also influence how I might go on that. But I just don't. If you want to be trying to figure out what's quote unquote new, I mean, we have a fairly narrow timeline now that we've described that in for nonprofit applicants, right? They can show money they've made in the previous 4 to the application date or 6 months after we approve them. So it's pretty, constricted time period to try to figure out whether people are, so if districts come up with money and their budget has not enlarged, it's got to be being taken from somewhere, right? So do we want to be in the position of trying to judge whether we agree with where it was taken from and therefore where it was put? That's part of I worry about the incentives giving, I guess, because if you don't know where it's going from, you don't really know whether it's a good idea to move it. So you're trusting in them to make that priority decision, which is, that's their job. But is that accomplishing what we want to accomplish? Well, I'm not sure.
I would argue that it is if you're really trying to prioritize some of the things that we're trying to prioritize, which is early investment, which shows through research that it pays off in the long run.
But what if they cut their early childhood funding to save their after-school program, and we don't know that they did that, but we find out after the fact?
I don't think they would cut their funding off before something else is funded. That doesn't make sense. They would close a program in the hopes that their proposal would get. I don't see that happening. And I also feel like, that's why we're up here and why we've hired such fabulous staff is to keep our eyes open and to, use our best judgment and our discretion. And I have full faith in you staff for digging under every rock. You do an incredible job.
But I just think that's
I get the administrative burden side.
There's not going to be time for it.
I know.
Just won't.
That is probably the most compelling for me because in an ideal world, I hate tying off potential sources that could really meet a need in the community. So, and then state, one of the arguments for the federal is that we're bringing new dollars to the local entity. So, I understand that a little bit more with city and county funds than I do state. If there was some possibility of tapping into state funds here that CHIF could leverage by matching, why would we not want to do that?
I think we're at the point where we're discussing it. I mean, this is the policy decision we're being asked to make. So questions are still
I'd either
welcome,
like to continue the debate or say, okay, we've done it enough, and let's go ahead and vote.
Yeah.
So,
and I would
can hold my peace and just vote.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to reiterate my support for the staff recommendations. I am concerned, as I expressed last time, about opening this up to local government general fund leveraging. And I think the staff has stated their reasons very well, but I just want to add one other reason, and that is, I think when we asked people to approve the children's levy in 2002, we said we're going to incent private investment to the table through the leverage fund. And, we largely did that. And I'm concerned that we won't have as compelling a message in a subsequent reauthorization discussion with voters if all we point to is other governments being the source of our match. It's just not as compelling of an argument, I think, for all the reasons that staff has cited. So I too will support the staff recommendation. So
I think they're both very compelling arguments, but I think you laid it out very well, your argument, so I would be in support of the staff recommendations. And, too, I think you guys did a really good job of outlining what an in-kind support and sponsorship for this would be. I think you guys did a great job of that.
Are we
You can
going
credit the feds for that.
Are we going to vote on section by section?
I think we should start with, to me there's three issues. One is the in-kind guidelines. Secondly is the minimum investment. And then the third issue is the general fund issue we've just been discussing. Why don't we start with the discussion of in-kind resources? Do people have concerns with the approach staff has taken on the 50% match? 24. We'll take testimony after we reach tentative decisions. So the issue is, are we comfortable with the way the 50% match, in-kind match, can be quantified? Yeah.
I have one suggested change. I'm okay with saying the preference for applicants with greater than 50% cash match, because I think preference is something that we state, and if that's stated, that actually may help the applicants seek greater cash contribution, which is part of the whole point of it, is to inspire other entities out there, private entities in particular, to contribute. But I would keep the word preference in there, because just like we had a preference for communities of color and projects east of 82nd Street, it's weighed against a lot of other things. So I'm very comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with capping the volunteer in-kind portion to 25% for the same reason. Anything that we do that continually ties our hands, I don't see benefiting the ultimate goal of really helping kids. I think, the argument there was that it may give mentoring groups an added benefit. I would think that when we look at a number of proposals that come to us, we're going to try to do the same kind of work that we've always had to do, which is look at how do we balance out across the spectrum, mentoring programs, full service after school programs, early childhood programs. And so I would never say, let's fund all those because they have, more volunteer support. It may make it easier for them to raise the volunteer portion or to find the match, but I don't think that it means that it's going to be, it gives them a leg up on our saying, yes, we're going to fund it. So I do think that in this economy with a lot of people being laid off, volunteer resources is one of the greatest assets we have in this community that we need to tap into.
Okay, so you're okay with the word preference for applicants with greater than 50% cash match. You're just would like to get rid of the 25% limit on the value of volunteers. Right. Okay. Chair Wheeler?
I just wanted to concur with that and just add a slightly different take on it. And that is, I think we should respect the different nature of different organizations in our categories. And some organizations are going to be personnel heavy as opposed to resource heavy. And we should do everything we can to encourage that diversity of organizations. And I do believe we're not just putting the burden on the staff, because again, I think your capacity issue is an important point. I believe we as a allocation committee can weigh that decision. I would recommend we remove that language.
Okay, is that a motion?
So moved.
Second? Seconded by?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion on that? I think I was the one that was probably most uncomfortable last time with the 50% match being potentially subsumed by volunteer labor, but I'm willing to go with this recommendation. So,
okay.
So with that, I guess we're all in favor of modifying or getting rid of the 25% local volunteer value and allowing that to go to 50%. All in favor of that, say aye.
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 Okay. Do you want to be voting, or do you want to take testimony before final votes? Or I mean, that's fine, but I don't know if there's anybody who's got comment on that. But I guess most people aren't going to be against that, so it's probably
well.
Fine,
I think let's go ahead and vote, and then we'll take testimony. And if there's compelling testimony, we can always reconsider.
Reconsider. Okay.
Yeah.
So that is an actual motion to reconsider. Okay. I didn't know.
Informal.
Okay.
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 No, we're not going to get that formal here. So did everybody vote?
I voted no.
I vote aye.
Okay.
Okay.
So 4 ayes, 1
4
no.
ayes and 1 no. Okay.
The next issue is the minimum match, or I'm sorry, the minimum
grant amount.
Minimum grant amount.
So as it stands right now, your recommendation is no less than $250,000 over a 2-year period.
Minimum of 2 years. You can be up to 4 years, or the life of the levy. Essentially, we're trying to end things when the funding will end, just so there's staff to be monitoring it.
So there's some discussion about lowering the minimum grant amount.
Mm-hmm.
What we're talking about. Adrienne, did you have a preference?
Yes, and I do understand staff capacity. And it also makes a difference understanding what the maximum amount of years that the match. So I would be in favor of the $200,000, because then that does allow, I think, smaller grassroots. It's easier for them to kind of look at raising $50,000 a year in match. Plus, I know that they also have the in-kind that they can also contribute to that. So I would be in favor of the $200,000.
Is that a motion?
I'd like to speak on that.
Okay.
I'd be in favor of going with the staff recommendation. I think we're right up against the limit just about now on where we're at with the levy language of allowing the 5% for administrative costs. And we've already, we're allowing in-kind, we're allowing volunteers, and the record keeping is going to be horrendous. So we're going to have lots more grants, lots more paperwork. And what are we going to do when we're out of staff expense? We have nowhere else to go, because that's the language of the legislation of the levy. So I would just as soon keep it at $250. You can have it for a longer time frame, so smaller organizations can have a smaller amount of money per year, but they can have it over a longer time period. So I would say I would just as soon keep it at $250 and start planning now to hold our administrative expenses in line.
I guess I would add a caution if you do go down, to be thinking when you're making your allocations, to be thinking about, you're going to have to think maybe a bit more heavily about the total amount of grants that you're making. So if you lower the minimum, you might, even though we might get a lot more applications, or that will allow, some level of more applications, that you still think about how many total grants you're going to do, just so we keep that within a reasonable amount.
Can you remind me what the minimum was in the past?
The minimum for leverage fund was $250.
It was all cash, no in-kind.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And the maximum grant amount was over 3 years. There was no It was
Because it started later.
Because it started later into the past levy, so it was more difficult.
Could I ask just kind of a nitpicky question? When we're calculating that 5% that we're trying to stay under to meet the commitment of the levy, the promise that we've made to the taxpayers, do we actually break that down by program area? I mean, could we go and look at the leverage fund and say the leverage fund accounts for X% of the overhead? No.
No. We're doing it. It's revenues over the life of the levy. Okay. So that's how it's tracked. I mean, we could.
You could break it down that way. I'm not sure it would tell us a lot. I mean, it would probably tell us that some of our program areas are more administratively burdensome than others, so to speak. And but I'm not sure that would necessarily change our priorities. I mean,
it would for me.
Okay.
I'll tell you how I'd use that information if I had it. If I knew that the administrative burden was greater, actually the way it would be most useful is in answering this question before us now. If we knew that the administrative burden was much lower for this portion of the program, that would mean that we have more flexibility in terms of the number of grants that we could potentially process. Never mind, it's geeky.
Well, the problem, I think, the main issue with looking at that
does
historically.
Anybody understand what I just said?
I totally understand.
Okay.
The problem with it is that you have to remember before the way we did it, it was administratively light. We're advocating adding more rigor to this. And so even if we looked at it last time, it wouldn't tell us much because we hired a firm to go out and help us go make connections and foundations and things come to us. There was no application process as such. It was a much lighter administrative burden. And we had thought about challenge grants, and frankly, Meg and I have said several times, this is why we didn't do challenge grants. Because challenge grants are a lot of work. I mean, it's just, it's much more rule heavy and much more administratively heavy to do it, which doesn't make it's not worth doing. We're advocating for it, but we're a little nervous that we can execute it all well. So that's our hesitation.
Okay, well, I'll just say I came in with, the clear intention of voting for $200,000, and I think, Ron, your comments were very compelling to me, especially since I've argued repeatedly for more flexibility in how nonprofits can tap into our funds. And if I'm arguing for flexibility that may bear more of an administrative burden, then I feel obligated to stick with the $250. I feel that we've done some really marvelous things to improve this particular leverage fund this time around. There's been a lot of changes, and so maybe we don't need to change absolutely everything about it.
If I can put some numbers to it, and I would be comfortable with $250,000 because $250,000 over a period of 4 years, that would mean that the nonprofit would have to raise the $62,500. If half were in kind, that would mean $31,000. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, in looking at smaller nonprofits, I think that's manageable.
That's pretty much what we felt. Okay. That I think most people can raise that much cash.
I just didn't know I was looking
year.
At the 2 years, but then looking at it over a 4-year period, it just breaking it down with numbers.
I thought afterwards I should have put a maximum. I should have put the maximum so people would understand. My thought was that smaller organizations would choose to spread that amount over a greater time.
Okay, so I sense there's general comfort then now with the $250,000. Mm-hmm. Okay. The final issue before we get to testimony, or do we need to vote on, is I don't know if we have to vote on if there's consensus, is the general fund, local government general funds. And I'm comfortable with staff recommendations, and for the reasons I stated, I'd like to see us stick with the staff recommendations.
I'm comfortable with the staff recommendations also.
But
on your point, I will lobby the school board and my local administrators to fund more programs.
I'm comfortable with staff recommendation.
Okay. It sounds like
I'm going to abstain for the record, but I'm comfortable going along.
Okay. I think you could make an argument, certainly for the school districts, at least being part of the mix in its full capacity. But as I say, I think you guys answered the question very thoroughly, and so you've made a persuasive argument as well.
Okay. Well, I think we're now at the point we'll take public comment. I would ask people who've already testified not to testify again, and we only have about 10 minutes. So how many people want to testify? How many hands? I see two. Okay. Two people, come on up.
Okay.
If you can just give us your name, and then you have 3 minutes. Up.
Julie Young with Chess for Success, and I want to speak to the $250,000 limit. If I'm understanding this correctly, say I'm a nonprofit and I have a 2-year project, so I come in for the $250,000. I have to have a budget of $417,000 a year. Not a budget. I have to have income last year of $417,000 to be able to come in and ask for that money, because 30% of that is the $125,000 that I would get from the Children's Investment Fund. And that concerns me for small nonprofits, because when I looked on the the charitable activities and downloaded all of the nonprofits, there are 11,888, something like that. Only 12% of them are above $417,000. So that eliminates a lot of smaller nonprofits who could be doing great work if they had this 2-year project. If it's a 4-year project, they have to have $208,000 budget. So it's still a lot of nonprofits that are doing great work that couldn't come in and ask for the money. So that was my concern. And it really doesn't affect us, but I think about the great work that I know of a lot of nonprofits, and they would be eliminated.
Well, that was definitely the reason I asked the question originally, because I was trying to figure out, is it from the prior year where it's the $250,000, what would be a third of, a budget that would render that a third, or is it the $250 divided over the period of the project? So my understanding it was going to be divided over the period of the project, so you're not taking the $250 and using that as kind of that 30%, but more so the $62.5. And so that's what was my understanding, but I'll let staff.
But if it's a 2-year project, it's $125 you would get from the Children's Investment Fund, or Portland Children's Levy. So then that does make it $417,000.
But they'd still be able to come, or they just did come under our regular programs, and we accept much smaller requests under those
But as far
programs.
as allocation, this one, and if they came in with 100% match, I mean, if they did their match was 100%, they wouldn't be as much administrative work as somebody who came in with this match and that match and that match that were in kind. Is that making sense? Anyway, that's my concern.
The math doesn't quite make sense, but I'm scared of making myself look like a fool. If you get 125, and roughly speaking, it's a third of the budget. Wouldn't your annual budget be $375 and not $400?
No.
Okay, well, that's why. That's why I don't want to belabor that point.
Okay. Thanks, Julie.
My name is Joshua Todd. I'm the director of the Multnomah County Commission on Children, Families, and Community. First off, I want to support the staff recommendations that came forward. I think they have served you really well, looking at some very specific criteria around how you will judge applications that come before you. I think the limitations around in-kind match and the timing really do limit some of the concerns that were stated around local government. What I want to propose, or at least allow you to think about, is the opportunity cost by saying that local governments cannot include either their own local funds, which I think there is a really strong case there, but also not allowing local governments to choose state dollars as match and also private donations as match. Currently, and we presented on last time you all met, the state of Oregon, Multnomah County, the Commission on Children, Families, and Community is looking at how do we fundamentally redo the way child welfare works in Oregon. There are some functions which are uniquely the role of local government and state government, and by shutting them off, our best providers in town will only be able to increase the success of children already in care. This specific program is one where it meets the fundamental goals that you all are trying to achieve, which is actually eliminating the number of kids entering the system. And under the current staff recommendations, we're no longer eligible. So that's one project that would be cut off because the match that we're trying to bring to the table are state dollars. And local governments, if we're the applicant as the local commission, would not be eligible for the leverage fund because the leverage that we're looking at are state and not federal. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. I think there's very few cases where this is really going to be a concern. And I think the committee actually has the room to look at, given the very strong recommendations and criteria that staff have put in place whether or not specific applications coming from local governments meet this criteria, because I think their reasoning is strong, but I do think there is that risk of losing the opportunity to make investments and have the children's levy really be able to say we were part of this very important work that's happening on a statewide level. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
I would actually like to hear from the African Women's Coalition, especially since they gave a recommendation as to what they thought of being that now broken out in numbers, if that would be doable, especially since you seem to be at a point where you're in transition. The majority of these individuals serving are volunteers already. And from the breakdown, when you look at the numbers, how do you feel about that? If you can come up.
So, yeah, one representative.
One, yeah.
I like this calling on people. This is good.
Good.
Charles is up next.
Did you wish to testify? Or? Okay.
I think that it's preferable to the option that was on the table before, and I really appreciate the effort to include grassroots groups like us. Our budget is pretty small right now, and so from what I understand, you're saying $62,000 is what we would actually have to raise.
Of which half of that could be in kind.
Okay, so
really
that
$31,000 in cash.
Yeah, that is doable. I think that the lady who I don't remember from the Chess for Success made some really great points as far as, if it is over a longer period of time, it seems like it's going to be a little bit harder. And that's a little bit of a problem because if social change work takes time. And if we're not in the position to have that time, then that's an issue. But, I think that these are great steps forward. And I also understand I'm not for overburdening staff at all, so. Yeah.
And it was more so if the project were to last 2 years instead of 4 years, then it would kind of decrease, or it would increase the burden on the nonprofit to raise more funds at a time. But if you have a project that's over 4 years, then that decreases it, including the 50% match of in-kind services.
I think it's a good compromise. Honestly, I really appreciate the effort to include the grassroots groups. So I think it could work. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was just going to say also that the incentive toward making it longer so that it's easier to reach, particularly for grassroots groups that may end up needing more support from staff, maybe more of an administrative burden, truthfully, because they need some help getting up to the levels of reporting that's required, is probably a good thing. It makes it a longer-term grant, makes it a little easier for them to attain because you're decreasing the amount that they need to raise per year. It gives them more time to build their capacity, and it means the staff is not constantly having to review and start new contracts every 2 years.
Deborah, I guess there's two other people. Did you want to make some comments? Okay, we're going to have to limit you to 90 seconds each.
That's fine. It's actually more a question than a comment at this point. For clarification, I'm Deborah Murray, and I'm the Executive Director of Peninsula Children's Center. Alyssa, correct me if I'm wrong, but what we're hearing from the philanthropic community is that nobody's doing multi-year grants at the moment. They're all in the process of reevaluating their funding streams, the return on their investments, and all that sort of thing. My question is, if we're making a proposal that's spread out over 4 years that we can put together with volunteer match and other things, do we have to have documented that we have secured funding over those 4 years, or is it with the intention that we might be able to get funding for the first year and then during that year we're going to work on funding for the next year, whether it's fundraising events, whether it's individual donors or whatever, because I don't think any of the smaller organizations, especially at this point, are going to be able to tell you that we have guaranteed funding over 4 years. So I just wanted to add that to the
If I can chime in, I had basically the exact same question and concern.
Okay. And your name?
Jill. Jill Weir with Campfire USA.
Okay. Thanks. What? Up the microphone.
It was our intention that that people raise them, that we give them that period of time to raise that full amount of match. So the 4 months before, the 6 months after. So you would have to raise the money up front. You don't have to, and that was our intention because we thought, okay, otherwise you're making the grant based on pretty prospective option down the line. doesn't have to be that way. You could do it on an annual basis if you want to do it that way. But that means you might have to, if people don't raise the money for the next year and have to show that by a certain time frame, then you're going to be in the position of having to cancel a grant. Mm-hmm. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. I don't know that off the cuff. I ask you do you have a preference? I mean, it was not our original conception. Our original conception is you would go out and you would write for a multi-year grant from another entity. I can't say as I have the same intelligence that Deborah has, so I can't say I wouldn't want to speak for the full funding community on that point. But it's true that. Go ahead.
I think conceptually it's a sound approach. I mean, we can't sort of be giving grants prospectively without knowing that the match is also there prospectively.
Well, you always have the right to cancel it. I mean, you just have to be willing to do it. I mean, I think that's what it would come down to. Each year you'd have to be showing that you raised the money by a certain point in time. Otherwise, we couldn't say we would go forward, right? So it would be a more of a monitoring task. I mean, I don't think it's impossible. It just wasn't our conception originally.
I think given the climate, and it is harder as far as foundations making multi-year grants, and the fact that also organizations can reach out to other entities, even donors, and when you have so many individuals getting laid off, I think right now, especially at this time, it's probably harder because that would mean that a small nonprofit would have to raise before the 4 months to the 6 months, $128,000. Mm-hmm. That's quite hard at this time. I would actually be in favor of doing it annually. I understand that there may be, a little challenge with that, but at the same time, if they are planning for it as the economy improves, I think that will be an easier time for them to raise money than to say at this point in time when foundations are cutting back. Everyone is cutting back, even though they say we're in a increase in our economy, but yet it's jobless economy. I think it would be quite difficult at this time.
Okay.
I can see both sides of this argument, and they're both really compelling. I think one of the things for us that would be difficult is if we're in the position of canceling grants with some frequency, it also means we're in the position of trying to re-let those funds and take more applications, which ends up, again, sort of running up against that administrative burden. So I think it's just something for us to also consider in thinking about sort of that annual look. Maybe it's a minimum of 2 years. Out of the 4 years, it's a minimum of 2 years. Maybe there's some kind of compromise to be had here, so it limits kind of our need to revisit grant cancellation and taking new applications. But then if we're 2 years down the road and we're getting toward the end of the levy, and then let's say you've only got really 18 months before the end of the levy, then we're talking about making really short leverage fund grants, and how much of a project can get sort of up and running if it's not in existence that may potentially have to be dismantled or scaled back. So I just think there's sort of questions about this annual revisiting.
If I could just add to that, it's a little bit like betting on the come also. If you make that grant, if we make that grant with the assumption that it's a longer-term project that's going to come to fruition, if we go year to year, we actually don't have the opportunity to investigate in depth whether or not there's forthcoming additional dollars to support that project. And I'm not sure we want to take on that burden. I realize what we're doing is we're shifting the burden to the CBOs, the nonprofits, to come forward and have those dollars in advance. But again, I just have to keep reminding myself we are not a foundation. This is taxpayer money. It's different. And the level of accountability is higher.
I mean, there's also another thing to think about. You might think about keeping it this way keeping the original recommendation for the first round, and let's see what happens. See if people are able to raise this money, and if they're not, it's a 6-month period. It's going to be a wait to find out if people can do it. And if the reality is that people cannot, or we see that the only people who are able to are large organizations, and it just we aren't able to support any smaller organizations, and that is a priority, that you then set aside some of your funds and change the rules so that you can, at that juncture, so you can bring people in. That's another option. I mean, there may be a few different ways to go. It may be the best thing to do given limited time, and I know we're running late, and people have to go. Should staff throw out some options for how we might do this rather than vote on this particular thing? Would you rather? We could do it via email.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a couple of, we've spurred some hands and some people with input. If maybe they could approach you and give you contact information, because they've been hearing this deliberation. There's people here who seem to have some good feedback. If they could find a way to get that feedback to you, I'd like to hear that feedback.
Okay.
So I think we should move ahead with the rest of the guidelines, and we may revisit the issue of the grant duration. Challenge grant.
Yeah. Sort of how much of the cash match has to be raised at what point, I think is the question. Okay. So why don't I have to run, but I'll have staff talk to folks who want to talk to in the audience, and then we can also put out to our grantees via email, soliciting comment on this issue, and then we can feed that back to you along with options and try to go from there.
Okay. So all those in favor of the guidelines, the leverage fund guidelines, will indicate by aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. So we've adopted the guidelines, subject to one minor tweaking, and now the application deadline will be March 1st, 2010.
I think we got to figure out this issue first until we can set the deadline. Let's just because we have to write the application. We haven't, we're going to use the RFI, but there has to be a bunch of stuff written in. So I just want to make sure we can get it written quick enough and do a good enough job, because you can see there are a lot of complications with this. There's a lot of things you don't think about that come back to bite you. So we just want to make sure we have time to do a good job on that. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. Our audience, the allocation committee, and staff, thank you for your good work as always. And we stand adjourned.